from the 30s onwards, or the Birmingham School of Cultural Sociology in Britain more recently. Left intellectualism has had a conflicted relationship with the national revolution, as everyone here will be aware. The Labour Party has tended to neglect culture. Its paper, The Irish People, I think, broadly speaking, can be described as having been a failure. We must note, in fact, that with Gramsci, that a political bloc or party must educate a people. But the country has never had a sustained left-wing party, has never been able to sustain a left-wing press of the kind that one might have found in Britain or in Europe. What's the effect of this now? One of the most useful results of a crisis, if there can be any kind of useful result of a crisis of the kind that we're in at the moment, is that it gives, when the system breaks apart, to put it very quickly, when the system breaks apart, everybody gets a slightly stronger sense as to how it might have been working up until then. And I think, I'm not trying to be glib, but I think that education is a salutary thing. But I think that identity thinking, I think that focusing on national identity persists, even as the cracks of the forged national consensus are showing. All efforts by the mainstream political parties to forge a universalized us, or national community, at this moment work along this line. Brian Lenihan's appeal for us all to put on the green jersey was precisely such an appeal. Any argument, as Andy Story pointed out yesterday, that we all partied and lost the run of ourselves and then we all suffered, is another example of this kind. The willingness, the craven willingness of the Labour Party, once again, to subsume the interests of working people in some notional national interests, which in fact are those principally of a Europe and multinational orientated elite. This is another example. All parties talking about protecting the most vulnerable persons in society, but the universality of this sentiment across the political board actually is the sign of its emptiness and its weakness. So for me, the task of critical intellectuals is to return once again to the weapons of the Marxist and dialectical traditions, which I still think provide the most potent equipment that we have for analysing societies in a capitalist crisis. Marxism in all its variety, many varieties, is the critical science of capitalism. Capitalism is in its greatest crisis in nearly a century. In this country, more than in most in the OECD. Now is the moment for left-wing thought in Ireland properly to forge links with working class and socialist movements, old and new, to forge a wider critical and alternative culture, well to the left of the RTE, Irish Times, Independent, Dublin 4, Brussels, Washington consensus, that recognises that the great bulk of the nation is composed of hard-working citizens of a notional republic, struggling to keep their lives and their families together. This has the potential to create a new hegemony, which would bypass the post-colonial and partitionist mentality. Thank you.
Has lived and travelled and worked widely. He is an original thinker and an author, and has written books in a variety of subjects. And he will be looking at the question of how we Irish see ourselves. So
I wrote a longish paper for this proceeding, this matter, and I didn't know I'd be in a panel and so on. So I think I'm going to. Since we want to get to the debate quickly, I'm going to summarise the first half of this paper and read the second half. And however, I've left some photocopies of the entire paper on the chair there, which can be handed round later. So I am to deal with how we Irish see ourselves. Sudden, very big shift in this evening's talk, and the relation of that to national independence. And first sight you'd say, what's the relationship at all? But there's of course a very profound one. History shows that any nation which is dependent or subject, for it to move to independence, it must form a view of itself. It must define itself. It must, in other words, recognize to. I'm not going to quarrel with Conor McCarthy, but he has said a lot of bad things to say about identity, but identity is key then. It must know, that they must know who they are and how they're distinguished from any other group in the world, and also what a valuable thing they are to deserve the independence. So the first necessary act in moving towards self-determination is that intellectual self-determination, deciding who we are and seeing themselves in those terms, and creating a shared idea of the nation's defining characteristics and values. Only then, with that defined notion and consciousness of its distinct self, can the nation set about realizing itself factually, acquiring the other attributes of normal nationhood, becoming a normal nation. In the late 19th century, the Irish nation at last performed this seminal intellectual act of defining its distinguishing characteristics and values. It came to see itself and to present itself as an ancient, essentially Gaelic nation. Catholic, but open to non-Catholic adherents. Rural, as opposed to the decadence of urban culture, which was the view at the time. A nation that had fought a long freedom struggle, and one that was opposed to all imperialism, and adhered to liberal democracy as the means of managing power. So that was, it formed this overall view of itself as I said, as ancient, essentially Catholic Gaelic nation, but open to non-Catholic adherents, rural as in opposition to the decadence of urban culture at the time, a nation that had fought a long freedom struggle and was anti-imperialist and given to liberal democracy as a method of politics. Right. Those were not only what the Irish nation perceived as its defining characteristics. They were at the same time what it perceived as its defining set of values, which together made it, the nation, a great value. All those were valuable characteristics, and they made the nation thereby a high value, worth suffering for, worth dying for if necessary. Moreover, 4 of those valued characteristics, ancient, Catholic, rural, and pursuing a long freedom struggle, were the features which, in the eyes of Europe and the wider world, characterized the Irish nation. That was how we were not only saw ourselves, but were seen. Equipped with that defining view of itself, the Irish nation fought its revolution. After achieving a moderate independence, it reaffirmed its identity in the terms defined before the revolution, and set about trying to add to those characteristics, fully sovereign, economically self-sustaining, and culturally self-shaping. We want to add those characteristics to the characteristics I've mentioned. Over a 20-year period, it made itself fully sovereign by taking a series of actions culminating in its declaration of neutrality in the Second World War. Achieving economic self-maintenance, another of the things it needed, meant in effect producing, mainly through Irish enterprise, sufficient saleable goods and services to pay for a standard of living sufficient to retain the existing population. This was made very difficult by the abnormally low level of economic enterprise in that same population. The state, in the 20s and 30s, contributed what it could to enterprise, which was generally lacking in the society. And during those same decades, the 20s and 30s, I'm just summarizing here, the nation proceeded to make itself culturally self-shaping in the terms that it had defined itself, Catholic, Gaelic, and so on. In foreign affairs, within successively the British Commonwealth, the League of Nations, and the United Nations, post-revolution Ireland played a confident and innovatory role. In the first 2 of those contexts, as on other occasions, that's within the British Commonwealth and within the League of Nations, Ireland enacted its opposition to imperialism. Now, in the 4 decades from the 40s onwards, the nation's ability to realize itself durably in the terms in which it had defined itself crumbled. crumbled piecemeal, and ultimately dissolved. The nation that had made the revolution began to disintegrate. During the war years, heavy migration from the countryside to the cities and abroad took place. As this increased dramatically during the 50s, Ireland ceased to be characteristically a rural nation. Gone. As the Gaeltacht shrank, criticism grew of the state's reliance for language of Bible and the schools. The language movement, notably Gaeling, produced some new approaches, and also from the 40s, public criticism of the crudely undiscerning book censorship became persistent. At the end of the 60s, it was reformed and rendered minimal. There's a taking down, there's a losing of the defining characteristics. The heavy decline of population in the 50s provoked a decisive response in the Whittaker-Lemass economic policies. Faced with the apparent evidence that the Republic could not be economically self-sustaining, one of the goals of the revolution, the Lemass government called foreign industrialists to the rescue. In the 60s, over 300 of them arrived. Henceforth, the Republic was to be dependent economically on a combination of foreign investment and enterprise, and after 1972, when Ireland joined the European Economic Community, on subsidies from that quarter. However, for the first time since the famine, the population began to increase. Another result of the government's new realism was its replacement of the policy of making Ireland Gaelic again by a vague policy of creating a bilingualism, which is a vague policy, with Irish retaining an honoured public position. Simultaneously in the 60s, American left liberalism, calling itself liberalism, was engaged in its ideological takeover of Western Europe. It was Imperial America's answer to Russia's implantation of the communist ideology in the countries of Eastern Europe and in East Germany. From London, the European centre of diffusion, the new liberalism was introduced in Ireland by Irish sympathisers, first tentatively in the Irish Times, then on RTE. By the early 80s, the Irish ideological pluralism of the Dublin mass media, there used to be pluralism of the Dublin mass media, believe it or not, was being replaced by left liberal orthodoxy. The Irish liberal correctorate, every West European country had one. By correctorate is the term I use to describe the core ideological group in each country that promotes the liberal ideology, corresponding somewhat to the party in a communist country, the core doctrinal group. The Irish liberal correctorate made clear its aversion to treating the historic freedom struggle as a national value. Accordingly, it was strongly hostile to the ongoing armed struggle of the northern nationalists. The Irish liberals also preached that the nation's Catholicism, or indeed any religion, was not a national value and should therefore not influence the Republic's affairs. On both these matters, they used the coordinated Dublin media daily to create a substantial public that was similarly minded. The correctorate, that core ideological group within the liberal orthodoxy, was de facto displacing the Catholic Church as the moral teacher of the nation. The legislators were conforming to it as diligently as they had to its predecessor. In 1985, a visiting American writer, William Buckley, noted the new public orthodoxy in his book, Memory Ireland, and sketched it as follows, I quote, "Ireland is not a nation. Once again, or ever, so the new story runs. But two nations, maybe several. It does not have its characteristic religion, or if it does, it ought not. It does not have its characteristic language, as anyone can see or hear. It has no particular race or ethnic integrity. Ireland is nothing, a no thing. An interesting nothing, to be sure, composed of colourful parts, a nothing mosaic. It is advertising prose